by the next time we do a reading, we'll be able to have the spooky music in the background. But for now, what this isn't a whole slideshow, but I have put together a few just images so that as I read, you'll be able to have some visuals to connect to all of this. And so my reading tonight, oh, first of all, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ursula Bielski. I'm in Chicago. I'm on the north side of Chicago, about 2 miles west of Wrigley Field in the neighborhood of North Center, where I grew up and where I've lived pretty much my entire life. I've been a paranormal investigator since 1988 when I got started in college investigating haunted places around Chicago. And I have been doing it ever since. I'm just working on my 15th book about haunted places. Most of my books are about haunted Chicago and the Chicagoland area. And this reading I'm going to do tonight is from a book that I was actually commissioned to write about 15 years ago. It's a book called Haunted Gary by History Press. And the editor contacted me to write this book because he had heard some interesting ghost stories about Gary, Indiana, which is, I don't know if you've ever been there or if you're familiar with where it is. It's right over the southeastern border of Chicago. So you cross the Illinois and Chicago state line at the same time, and then you're in Indiana. And Gary at one time was, America's hometown. It was one of the greatest cities in the United States, as you probably know. Today, it's one of the most dilapidated cities in the United States, and it's essentially abandoned, which is a shame because it's just a really remarkable place right on the shore of Lake Michigan, the shore of on the Indiana Dune land, one of the most beautiful places in the country, the Indiana Dunes National Lake Shore now. I hope that Gary comes back. If you're interested in moving to a really cool place, you can get a mortgage in Gary in a beautiful old brick house for like $50 a month. I keep trying to get my friends together and just all move there together and just start over, because I think that just would be a wonderful thing. It's such a beautiful place. But it was a very vibrant place. And the book I wrote, the stories go across like just a wide breadth of different situations. There are stories about the steel mills and the steel workers who died by falling in the heat, the molten metal. There are stories about the ghost of Klein Avenue, famous vanishing hitchhiker in Gary. There are stories about the Small Farms area, this wooded, swampy area with lots of ghost stories going back many years. There are gangland stories. In fact, John Dillinger, as you probably know, his madam had a brothel down in North Chicago, and that was a place where he spent a lot of time, and there's a lot of criminal activity going back there as well. And then, of course, the famous Diana of the Dunes, the hermit who, this brilliant young woman who attended school at the University of Chicago and decided to just drop out of society in the 1920s and went to live on the beach in the dunes. And her ghost is still sometimes seen by fishermen and swimmers swimming usually at dawn right off the shore of Ogden Dunes in near Gary, Indiana. So this story that I'm going to read to you tonight, and we're going to have questions after, is one of the most interesting stories that has come up in the last 100 years in ghost lore in America, and it's established itself among the most haunted houses in Chicago history, right up there with the Villisca Apps murder house, the Lizzie Borden house, the Winchester Mystery House, the Amityville Horror House, and now we have the Demon House. You probably, if you're interested in ghost stories, are familiar with the Demon House from the show Ghost Adventures and the movie that was made based on the fact that the team leader and the producer of Ghost Adventures, Zak Bagans, purchased the house after Ghost Adventures team investigated it. And he discovered that there was something there, he said, that just encompassed what he was looking for all of these years as a paranormal investigator. And he wanted to own that house so that he could examine it further, deeply, deeply, deeply. So we're going to be talking, I'm going to be reading my story from, again, Haunted Gary. And this is the story of, and then when we're done, I'll turn on the chat again, and then we can have questions and answers afterwards. The reading, I believe, it's a bit long, and it will probably take about 20 minutes. And then we'll have our question and answer afterwards. So this is chapter 7 of Haunted Gary, The House of 200 Demons. The 2011 film The Rite, starring Anthony Hopkins, introduced a whole new generation to the reality of possession and exorcism, as seen through the eyes of a young seminarian who regains his wavering faith by studying under a Vatican exorcist. The Rite, based on a true story, loosely follows the life story of Father Gary Thomas, a Saratoga, California priest who is one of about 24 official exorcists in the United States. That is, they have been sanctioned by their bishops to perform exorcisms. In a seminal work on possession and exorcism, Hostage to the Devil, the late Malachi Martin, himself a former Jesuit priest who sat in on numerous exorcisms in contemporary North America, based his entire book on the thesis that an exorcism is the final rendezvous among the demon, the victim, and the exorcist, all of whom have been inextricably linked from before birth. Sometimes that exorcist is not a sanctioned one. Sometimes the exorcist is called to his ministry when it is the last thing expected. Father Michael Maginot, a Catholic priest assigned as pastor of the St. Stephen Martyr Parish in Maryville, Indiana, has just finished filming, as of this writing, a documentary of his own experience, the 2012 Gary, Indiana exorcism of a woman named Latoya Amons. In the fall of 2011, Amons, her mother, Rose Campbell, and Latoya's 3 children moved into a small rental house on Carolina Street. The street is sleepy, at least for Gary, and the family was close-knit and seemingly well-adjusted, despite Latoya's status as a single mother trying, like so many, to make ends meet. By May, however, Latoya would have her children taken from her by Indiana's Department of Child Services, citing, quote, severe spiritual stress, end quote, resulting from what Latoya and numerous others believed was demonic possession. Latoya would go on to give her story to the Indy Star, specifically to a reporter named Marissa Kwiatkowski. The resulting article would become the most read article in the Star's history, and the family story was one of the most notable appearances of the paranormal in American media history, even leading the nation's most popular ghost hunter to purchase the family's former home, what became known as the Demon House, or the House of 200 Demons. Latoya and her family had been in the house scarcely a month before strange events began, starting with the appearance of swarms of flies. Evocative of a horror movie, huge black horse flies suddenly infested their screened-in porch before Christmas, seemingly oblivious to the freezing temperatures. Latoya and her mother put down fly paper, swatted and swept up the insects day after day, but the infection persisted. Soon, one by one, other events unfolded. On one occasion, a few minutes after midnight, Rosa and Latoya both said they heard the steady clump of footsteps climbing the basement stairs and the creak of the door opening between the basement and the kitchen. Fearing an intruder, the two waited with bated breath at their bedroom doors for many, many minutes, fearing even a move to call police. After much time had passed, LaToya flicked on the lights and went to inspect the kitchen and basement. No one was there. Even after a thorough inspection and putting a lock on the door, the noise continued night after night, worsening with the sound of pounding on the door and sometimes the growling of what sounded like an animal. Rosa said she then awoke one night and saw a shadowy figure of a man pacing back and forth in her living room. Fearing an intruder, she lay paralyzed in bed until morning and then went to investigate. Though the doors and windows were still locked from the inside and nothing seemed to be missing, the family found large, wet footprints on the living room floor. On March 10th, 2012, the family was up late. There had been a death in the family and friends were over, chatting and reminiscing into the evening hours. During the evening, LaToya's daughter complained of being pulled off the couch by an unseen force. Shortly after, one of the boys was thrown into a freezer adjacent the living room. Later, sometime after the children had gone to bed, suddenly the adults' conversation was interrupted by a piercing cry from the girls' room where she was sleeping with a cousin. When Rosa got to the room and switched on the light, she saw the body of her daughter drop to the bed. According to the cousin, the girl had been levitating, still asleep, about 2 feet from the ceiling of the bedroom. The visitors never came back to the house on Carolina Street, and there were others who refused to enter the house, but for a different reason. The local churches, which LaToya and Rosa begged for help, turned a deaf ear to their pleas, believing that the women were imagining or fabricating their tales. I'm just going to duck out here and change my slide. This is Rosa Amons and on the left, and LaToya Amons on the right. Rosa is LaToya's grandmother, and this was a still shot from the interview that was first given to the Indy Star. Eventually, after an especially tearful visit to one small community church, a minister visited the house and declared that it was troubled by spirits. The recommended remedy was a thorough cleaning with bleach and ammonia, followed by the inscribing of crosses on all of the doors and windows. Also prescribed was the anointing of the family members with oil. The first mention of demons in connection with the house seems to have been when LaToya and her mother contacted 2 clairvoyants who sat the women down with the news that the house was infested with more than 200 demons and that the forces were emanating from the basement. The clairvoyants told the women that they must remove the children from the house at once. But with nowhere else to go, LaToya was forced to resort to Plan B. At the advice of one of the clairvoyants, she built a makeshift altar in the basement, covering a table with a sheet and placing on it a pure white candle and a statue of the Holy Family. LaToya, dressed in white and using a stick of sage from a local occult shop, went through the house with the burning stick, reading from Psalm 91, invoking God's protection. After blessing and smudging every room of the house with the aromatic herb, she returned to the basement and placed the Bible on the rude altar, open to the psalm she had just read. What followed was 3 days of peace, and then the real trouble began. LaToya went on to record with the Indy Star, claiming that demons then possessed not only her, but also her 3 children, 12, 9, and 7 years old. The possession would come and go without warning, but there was no mistaking when it was happening. The children's eyes bulged and flared, accompanied by loveless smiling and gruff intonations of cryptic words and phrases. They all felt lightheaded and besieged by an almost crippling fatigue. Headaches were a daily problem for nearly everyone in the house. LaToya described seeing her children first engaged with and then tormented by whatever was in the house. Each child was targeted differently. The youngest began speaking of an imaginary friend who would coax him into the closet to play with him for hours on end, and who talked about knowing what it was like to be killed. LaToya's 9-year-old once began speaking about what it feels like to be murdered, and her daughter, 12, heard a disembodied voice tell her she would not live another 20 minutes and that her family was going to be taken away. LaToya claimed her family also continued to be physically attacked in the house. Her daughter assaulted by a heavy headboard, battered so hard that she needed stitches, and her younger boy flying out of the bathroom as if by some tremendous force. The attacks became so bad that some nights, for relief, the family stayed in a hotel. With their spiritual remedies seemingly exhausted, LaToya and Rosa appealed to their family physician for help. The doctor told a reporter later that even he was scared when he first heard of the events in the Amons house. But from the notes he wrote in the family's file, delusional, hallucinations, he apparently was more afraid for their mental health than of any supernatural manifestations. That would change abruptly, however, with a physical visit to the doctor's office. According to the testimony of medical staff that appears in the files of the Department of Children's Services, the two young boys began cursing the doctor in low, growling voices. The younger boy then being lifted and thrown against the office wall. Both boys then fainted and someone called 911. A flurry of police officers arrived, no one quite sure what was going on. And then the boys were taken to a local hospital where staff literally laughed off LaToya's accounts of their troubles. When the boys woke up, the 9-year-old seemed himself, but the younger child had to be held down by 5 men. Someone, whether from the hospital or the doctor's office, then called the Department of Child Services to report the situation. Soon after, a caseworker arrived at the hospital to interview the family. An exam had found the children healthy and free of bruises or other marks. LaToya had been examined by a hospital psychiatrist and found to be stable. But while the caseworker interviewed the children, the 7-year-old began growling and baring his teeth. His eyes bulged and rolled back in his head. He then attempted to strangle his older brother and had to have his hands pried off his brother's throat by several adults in the room. Suspecting that the children were for some reason performing at their mother's urging, the caseworker later brought them into an isolated exam room, joined by a nurse and their grandmother. According to the caseworker's notes, the younger boy immediately began to growl again before telling his brother, "It is now time to die." At the same time, the older boy began thrusting his head into his grandmother's stomach, at which point Rosa grabbed his hand and began to pray. It is what happened next that made the world take notice. With a weird grin, the older boy walked backward several steps and backwards up the wall to the ceiling, walked across the ceiling over his grandmother, and landed on his feet, never letting go of his grandmother's hand. The caseworker told the Star reporter that she and the nurse ran out of the room and then called security. The caseworker also said she believed an evil influence might be at work in the lives of the Amons family. Though the youngest boy spent the night in the hospital with LaToya, the next day was his 8th birthday, and the family returned with cake and small gifts. After the makeshift party, DCS informed LaToya that her children were being taken away from her without a court order. The caseworker had written in the report that all of LaToya's children were under, quote, spiritual and emotional distress. LaToya was devastated. After all of the family had fought through, the idea of her being suspected of abuse or neglect was too much to bear. The children, too, were hysterical over the idea of being separated from their mother, but nothing could be done. Incredibly, however, the family had been at the hospital long enough to catch the attention of the hospital chaplain. And on the morning of April 20th, 2012, he put in a call to Father Michael Maginot, the pastor of St. Stephen Martyr Parish in nearby Maryville, Indiana, requesting something extraordinary, an exorcism for a young Gary boy. Though skeptical of the claims, Maginot agreed to visit the family after Mass that weekend, and on April 22nd, he arrived as promised at the house on Carolina Street. Father Mike. Maginot was a believer in demons, but also sensible and forthright. He told LaToya and Rosa that the first thing they needed to do was rule out any natural causes for what was happening. For the next 2 hours, Father Mike listened as the two women laid out the history of the case in grim detail. During the interview, the bathroom light took to flickering on occasion, stopping each time the priest walked over to investigate. Blinds on the kitchen window, too, swung back and forth as they talked, and wet footprints appeared in the living room, as they had to the two women so many nights before. At one point, LaToya complained of a headache, prompting Father Maginot to place the crucifix against her forehead, and then her body began to convulse uncontrollably. After a meticulous 4-hour interview, Maginot said he was convinced the family was being tormented by demons, but also that he believed there were ghosts, human, deceased entities in the house. He went from room to room, blessing each with holy water and reading passages from the Bible as he walked. As he stood to leave, he strongly encouraged LaToya and Rosa to leave the house. Less than a week later, however, the two women were back at the house to let the case manager check the condition of the home. The caseworker arrived with a police officer she'd asked to accompany her and 2 other officers who'd asked to come out of curiosity. The group went from room to room, inspecting first the main floor and its 3 bedrooms, living room, and bath. The kitchen door, where the first sounds had started, led to the unfinished basement with concrete floors. Directly under the stairs, however, was a dirt floor. The concrete around it was jagged, as if it had been broken. LaToya told police that the demons seemed to originate from that patch of dirt, and you can see that dirt under the floors of the house there when they were still intact. One of the officers present was a Gary police captain who went on record saying that he came to believe in demons after visiting the demon house. During the visit, an officer's audio recorder malfunctioned. The power light flashed to indicate the batteries were dying, even though the officer had placed fresh batteries in the recorder earlier that day. Another officer recorded audio, and when he played it back later, heard an unknown voice whisper, "Hey." The officers took photos of the house. In one photo of the basement stairs, there was a cloudy white image in the upper right-hand corner. When the officer enlarged the photo, that cloud appeared to resemble a face. The enlargement also revealed a second green image that police say looked like a woman. These are classified photos I haven't been able to see. The Gary police captain said photos he snapped with his cell phone also seemed to have strange silhouettes in them. The radio in his police-issued Ford malfunctioned on the way home. And later that night, the garage at his Gary home refused to open, even though the power was on everywhere else. On the way home, the driver's seat in his car had also started moving backward and forward on its own. When he took the car to the dealership, the mechanic told him the motor on the driver's seat, which was broken, which could have caused a deadly accident. In April 2012, DCS petitioned Lake Juvenile Court for temporary wardship of the 3 children. The request was granted. An investigation had found that LaToya had neglected her children's education by not having them in school regularly. The finding was not just a symptom of the tragic events on Carolina Street. Records showed that the same situation had been recorded in 2009, 2 years before the family had moved into the so-called Demon House. The older children were sent to St. Joseph's Carmelite home in neighboring East Chicago, while the younger child was sent to another live-in facility for psychiatric evaluation. There, a clinical psychologist found him stable and coherent, except when he talked about demons. It was only then that his talk became, quote, illogical. He tended to change the subject, and his stories varied each time he was asked about the events in the house. Wright believed the now 8-year-old did not suffer from a true psychotic disorder. She wrote in her report that the case of was one of, quote, delusion instilled in the boy by his mother. The psychologist at St. Joseph's had the same diagnosis. LaToya had presumably influenced the older children into believing that the family was possessed by demons. The recommendations set forth by the Department of Child Services included a stipulation that discussion of demons and being possessed could not be part of the family conversations anymore. They were also instructed to seek therapists on a regular basis. Interestingly, LaToya was also instructed to find work and other housing, quote, due to the paranormal activity, end quote, which police and DCS officials continued to investigate. Rosa, LaToya, and the 3 officers from the initial visit returned to the Demon House on Carolina Street on May 10th, 2012. They were joined by Father Maginot, 2 Lake County officers with a police dog to help determine whether a body might be buried in the house, and a different DCS caseworker who had volunteered to take the original worker's place, who had quit because she didn't want to go back into the house. The group went down into the basement where the caseworker saw a peculiar substance dripping from the wall. Touching it, the group found it slippery and tacky. Father Maginot told police he wanted to investigate the dirt floor under the stairs for either a human body or a pentagram or personal objects buried there, which would indicate a curse and consequently a demonic presence in the house. Police said the dirt area looked like the concrete might have been removed specifically to bury something. And with this added information, they began to dig. They unearthed a curious variety of objects: a pair of boys' socks, a decorative pot with a lid, a woman's fingernails, a heavy weight as from a grandfather clock, and clothing from another era, devoid of nylon, polyester, or other synthetics. After unearthing what Maginot describes as 3 layers of objects, the officer shoveled the dirt back in and the priest sprinkled the area with blessed salt. Back upstairs, the caseworker and LaToya began to complain of maladies. LaToya felt an intense pain in her head, and the caseworker soon complained of pain in her finger. The skin on the digit had turned pale and felt tingly as if it was constricted. She then said she was having a panic attack and needed to go outside. The police captain left soon after while the others stayed to continue their investigation of this home. And it was at this time that they noticed the same slippery substance dripping from the blinds in a bedroom. More than a month earlier, LaToya and her mother had blessed the doors and windows with olive oil at the suggestion of a church worker. But the oil never dried and almost seemed to increase in substance and quantity. Unable to determine the source of the substance coming from the blinds, Maginot and the police officer wiped it off and closed the door to the room to see if it would appear on its own again, suspecting Rosa or LaToya of placing it there. When they returned about a half hour later, the substance had indeed reappeared. Father Maginot told the officers that such unknown substances were often found as a physical manifestation of demonic possession. It was this manifestation, on the heels of all he'd seen and heard, that led Father Maginot to write to Bishop Dale Meltzer and request permission to form an exorcism at the Carolina Street Demon House. Maginot attested the Bishop of Gary had never sanctioned an exorcism in the diocese during his more than 2 decades of service in his position. True to form, the bishop denied Maginot's plea as well, directing him to seek the guidance of other priests who had performed exorcisms. Doing so, Maginot said his advisors told him to do what's called a minor exorcism on LaToya. He arranged to perform a series of powerful blessings on the house and then to perform a minor exorcism on LaToya herself. The case manager and 2 police officers attended the exorcism rite, during which the caseworker claimed to feel something unseen in the room. That same caseworker told a reporter that after the visit, problems attended her constantly, everywhere she went. In a few weeks, she was burned in a motorcycle accident, broke her ribs jet skiing, and broke her hand and an ankle in separate incidents. Working from the directives that had been given to him from sanctioned exorcists in the archdioceses of Indianapolis and Chicago, Maginot gave LaToya an important directive to identify the names of the demons who had been attacking her family. In an exorcism, it is very important for the identity of the demon or demons to be revealed. Maginot told LaToya to think about the things that the demon or demons had done and to find their names based on the harms that they had caused. LaToya claimed that while she searched on the internet for the names, the computer kept freezing and turning itself off, and that she felt nauseated and dizzy. But she persevered, eventually finding names that felt right to her, including the names of demons assigned to harm children. After hearing the names, Father Maginot revealed to LaToya that he had received the bishop's permission to exorcise her with the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. 3 major exorcisms were required to complete the task. The first 2 were done in English, the third in Latin. In attendance were 2 of the police officers who had been involved in the case since the first home visit to Carolina Street, to offer both emotional and physical support in case the superhuman strength common in exorcisms became an issue. During the first 2 exorcisms, LaToya convulsed and thrashed, falling asleep at times, which Father Maginot believed was a way for the demons to lessen the power of the ritual. LaToya would not speak normally, but only in satanic chants. But the hold seemed to lessen by the end of the second attempt, after which Father Maginot went on retreat. By the time of the final exorcism in June of 2012, the police no longer came. Father Maginot asked his brother to assist. The This final exorcism was in the church's native tongue, Latin, and after some minor convulsions during the event, Latoya once again fell asleep. This would be, at least for now, the end of the possession of Latoya Amons. She regained custody of her children in the fall of 2012, taking them to her new home in Indianapolis, where she'd moved with her mother during the DCS investigations. I talked with Father Maginot in the spring of 2015, 3 years after the events in the Amons house. I found out that he was not an appointed exorcist of the Diocese of Gary when he found himself ministering to the troubled family of Latoya Amons. This job had found him. But like most priests, he was no stranger to the paranormal. Many priests perform a surprising number of routine house blessings to quell paranormal activity, especially that encountered after death in a home or after a move or a remodel. Father Maginot doesn't typically see spirits when he finds himself ministering to those with disturbances in their homes. But this time, he says, it was different. And this is verbatim from my interview with him. I did witness things, and in fact, it was things Latoya and her mother were telling me would happen in the house. And then when I was there, they happened. I would witness them. I knew these things had something to do with Latoya's ex-boyfriend. Things struck me strange about him. Whenever I would talk about him, things would happen. And I thought, what is the involvement here? Who is involved here? Children? But then when I pressed the crucifix to Latoya's forehead and she began to convulse, I knew it was about her. Father Maginot nods to the popular cultural perceptions about possession and The Exorcist and other films and books. But he says this too was different. This is another verbatim section of our interview. You normally think it's something you brought on yourself. And that's what we always hear, a Ouija board, some occult thing. But when it was shown that this was something that had happened to them, we were baffled. Latoya was never involved in the occult. She never dabbled in anything. But I did think something was brought in with the boyfriend. The last time he was there, things had gone up to a level where it almost drove the family out of the house. Latoya had been seeing this man for some time when she discovered he was married. She broke it off, but he continued to pursue her, even finding out the location of the new house on Carolina Street and showing up at the door, sometimes trying to see her children while she was at work. Latoya had found out about the man's wife from his wife, who called her one afternoon to confront her. Latoya was dumbfounded, but assured the woman she wanted nothing to do with an adulterer and would never see him again. But before she could hang up, Latoya heard the woman's last words. She said, "You will regret ever messing with my husband." Now, few people, even Catholics themselves, are aware that the church believes in the reality of curses, not the mere power of suggestion, but that people and families can be actually and deeply affected by powerful dark forces deliberately affixed or sent to them to wreak havoc in their lives. According to the Roman Catholic Church, human souls don't do the bidding of mortals, only of God. Ghosts do not do the bidding of demons. It is demons alone that are on call for the whims of the living. And if a person or a family is run down without a firm foothold in faith and prayer life, distracted by the business of living or struggling to live, or even merely physically debilitated, the results of a curse can be devastating. Crucial to a curse is the cursed object, a piece of hair, a photograph of the person, clothing, a ring, eyeglasses, or any other important and intimate item inextricably connected to the target of the curse. It is this object over which the curse is made. And in the case of the Amons family, there were many possibilities. As Father Maginot remembers, that's another quote, "We felt there must be some sort of curse because there were many things that were strange. The first time the boyfriend moved in with her, Latoya, he asked for her underwear. She asked what for. He told her it was to, quote, remember this wonderful moment or such thing. But also at that time, and she never thought about it until later, she was missing a pair of gym shoes, expensive shoes she'd bought, and it was a big deal. And she thought, well, the kids took them or was wearing them or had messed them up and got rid of them, but they could never find them. Also around the same time, Latoya wanted to have a family picture in the living room, and she was looking through the stack of photos she had and saw this photo, and photos of the kids were missing. She never found where those pictures were. I asked Father Maginot about what he and the police and the social worker found under the stairs when they dug under the dirt floor and what he thought it all meant. Father Maginot said he believed these objects may have been a part of necromancy, the attempt to conjure up the dead, and that he felt they were not related to the Amon's case, but likely the reason for the ghosts in the house. I wondered if Father Maginot had experienced any residue from the exorcisms, what paranormal investigators often call attachments, perhaps some energy or entity that was making itself known to him at his home or in his church. He said, after the exorcism and also toward the end of it, at our parish, we had several storms come through at that time when the last exorcism had been done. One was after Mass on Saturday, and it knocked out all the lights in the church. But they were able to get the lights back on before our 9 o'clock Mass on Sunday. The second time was the longest, around the 4th of July. This was right around the time of the final exorcism's day. We were doing the exorcism in the church, and Latoya's mouth was moving, but nothing was coming out. The lights went out, and later she told me that she was trying to tell me that something was trying to lift her up. The demon may have tried to gather the energy from the lights and electricity to do that. They weren't able to do it, though, because we were in the church with the Blessed Sacrament. After the 4th of July, we had another storm come in, and it knocked out our power for more than a day. It was about 90 degrees at the church, and my rectory was horrible, trying to sleep at night, about 85 degrees at night. But then they got the power back on 30 hours later. Then another storm came and knocked out the power in the church. We had Mass by candlelight, and we brought out these candelabras and lit all the candles. That was beneficial because the week after that, right in the middle of Mass, the power went out again until we brought in the candelabras and lit the candles without missing a beat. We never had a loss of power like that before. Never. The national fervor that followed the release of Jay Anson's novel, The Amityville Horror, in 1977 remains matchless in American paranormal history. The closest thing to it before this time was the very regional frenzies that had broke out in Adams, Tennessee, on the Bell family farm during the reign of the terror of the so-called Bell Witch, and to a much more important extent in Salem, Massachusetts in 1620. These two other events paled, 1692. These two other events paled in widespread renown, of course, in comparison to the former. By the time the Amityville troubles became national news, the nation of Salem and of John Bell had become a celebrity-studded media paradise. There have, however, been only minor appearances of the paranormal in modern American history besides Amityville. There was Ted Sirius, the Chicago bellman, who in the early 1960s appeared on numerous television programs attempting to demonstrate his claimed ability to imprint Polaroid film with images from his mind. In the 1980s, a 14-year-old Columbus, Ohio girl named Tina Resch became briefly famous as a poltergeist agent and went on to go to prison for the alleged murder of her toddler years later. By the year 2000, the internet allowed those interested in the paranormal to create and populate their own worlds, both locally and through web forums and on social media. And haunted places have come to be reported either through these outlets or on paranormal-themed television programs, not in the mainstream news. Paranormal activity has, since then, mostly occurred under the radar of the mainstream news media, with one exception, just one: the case of Gary, Indiana's Demon House. Not long after Marissa Kwiatkowski's story broke, the house was purchased by Zak Bagans, the star of the immensely popular Travel Channel series Ghost Adventures. Bagans, a tight-shirted, muscular, spike-haired young man who now lives in Las Vegas, began as a film student in Michigan and ended up a celebrity when his 2007 documentary about a team of 3 ghost hunters became an overnight sensation. Together with Nick Roth and Aaron Goodwin, Bagans filmed 8 seasons and counting, many more now, of Ghost Adventures, and he now serves as executive producer and enjoys the adoration of millions of fans around the world, who, despite criticisms of the show's alleged fakery, continue to turn in. In 2014, Bagans announced that he had been living in the Demon House on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana, and filming a documentary about the house and the case, scheduled for release in October of 2015. Though I have worked with Bagans on several occasions, and I'm good friends with the show's writer and historian, Bagans gave no response to me for requests for an interview, a tour of the house, or even a comment about the case. Len Miller and J.C. Rositas, the former Gary police officer and both esteemed paranormal investigators, were the first to offer investigative services to the Amons family during the time before the events had escalated to their most dramatic, and when police in the city were baffled about what was happening. Their offers to investigate, however, were refused. After the story broke, next came Bob Jensen, founder of Ghostland Society, located in Wisconsin. Jensen and his team traveled to the house on 3 separate occasions, finding no evidence whatsoever of paranormal activity. When asked why they kept going back, Bob explained that it is the team's standard practice when children are involved to make absolutely certain there is no danger to the family. David Scott and John B. Stevens of the paranormal research group Illinois Paranormal Research Association are videographers who film an award-winning internet show called Believe, an online paranormal experience on YouTube. A few days after the appearance of LaToya's story in the Indy Star, the pair traveled to Gary to attempt to speak to the current owners. Though no one seemed to be at home, they took some film footage and recorded for electronic voice phenomenon, EVP, Voices of the Dead, using a so-called ghost box or ghost radio. Many investigators believe that disembodied energies use these radios to form words, essentially allowing investigators to communicate with spirits in real time. When John was recording, a voice in the box called out, "John!" And later, several different voices cried out, "David!" When asked whether one of the voices speaking had possessed LaToya Amons in the house, a male response claimed flatly, "I did." Voices also claimed that there was a human buried in the house, and another voice said that what was in the house did, quote, "not know Christ." During my talk with Father Michael Maginot, I asked him with a smile if he is now the go-to exorcist for the Diocese of Gary and whether the diocese had been slammed with requests for exorcism since the Amons story broke. Father Maginot is so good-natured and he laughs readily, but he doesn't respond that way to this question. Rather, he says very seriously, "There is one in Gary right now, and it is a very sensitive situation. It involves an expectant mother. She's about to give birth, but I think the bishop wants someone more experienced. The Indianapolis diocese has an exorcist, and the bishop has talked to him, but I think also he may be shopping it around for just the right person. It has to be the right person." And that is from the book Haunted Gary from History Press. And this is what happens after my story ends here in this book, which was published in 2016. As you probably know by now, Zak had the house boarded up. The film didn't come out on schedule at all. It was supposed to be released at Halloween of 2015, and it was only released in 2018, I believe, or it was even last year. Might have even been last year. I want to say it was the fall of 2018, but it might have been 2019. There was all kinds of talk about the effect, the powerful effect that this case had on Ghost Adventures and the Ghost Adventures crew, those three guys, Nick Groff and Aaron and Zak. And as you probably know, if you watch Ghost Adventures and have for a while, Nick Groff left the show during this time, and there was some talk that whatever happened in this house was kind of the nail in the coffin for him with the show. I don't know if any of that is true. I don't know if we ever will. After leaving the house, Zak had the house boarded up, and you can see it here after the windows were boarded up for the Demon House film. If you've seen the Demon House film, you know that in the film, Zak, in the final part of the film, after the investigation of the house, which includes Dr. Barry Taff, a very esteemed longtime paranormal researcher, parapsychologist. After these investigations, the last day in the house, Zak has, his team members board him up in the house for the night. And during that night, it's a pretty quiet night, but the last portion of the film, we see that Zak is in one of the bedrooms and something happens where he hears some very strange sounds and sees something. And that is just about the end of the film. What happens after that, we now know, is that, and this happened before the film came out, when the headlines displayed that Zak was having the house bulldozed. So the Demon House on Carolina Street is bulldozed, it's torn down, and the lot is empty now. If you saw the film, you know that some very strange things happened during the filming of the movie. When Dr. Barry Taff came in, the parapsychologist, there were the cameras all over the house filming the investigators as they were going from room to room. You could see aggressive behavior just come out of nowhere as people were in the house, including in Zak. At one point, you see Zak is behind one of the investigators, and he puts up his hands and goes toward the back of this other investigator, like with his hands, like he's going to strangle him, and then realizes what he's doing and stops. Later that day, after the investigation, they go back to the hotel, and one of the team members, who's part of the production crew, the filming crew, has something come over him, this sort of possession come over him, where he becomes violent and suicidal. Later, we found out that Dr. Barry Taff, became very severely ill after filming the Demon House movie and was hospitalized for some time. And then, as you probably know, Zak Bagans, after that night, began to have problems with his eyes. In fact, it was exactly the very next day that Zak began to have blurred vision and double vision, seeing two of the same thing. And he went to several different ophthalmologists who told him that he had developed double vision literally overnight, which is absolutely insane for that to happen. And they had no explanation for how it could have happened. And they told him that he would have to wear prism glasses for the rest of his life or risk losing his sight forever completely. And so, as you probably know, Zak, when Zak started wearing those black frame glasses, we all thought it was a fashion statement, because he's kind of like a fashionista type guy. And we thought he was trying to look smart, or it was like, they were just like glass clear lenses, but it turns out that these are prism glasses that he now has to wear for the rest of his life. The house on Carolina Street is no longer there, but the story of the demon house has become taken its place as one of the most famous stories of a demonic possession in history, and the demon house, one of the most haunted houses in American history, and one of the most famous paranormal stories in American history. Whether the events of the demon house will continue to affect Zak and the other members of the team and investigated and people who visited there, we may never know. People are concerned. I know people are concerned about a house being built on that property. They feel that when the house was torn down, it probably released whatever was there kind of out. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens. The story, of course, is ongoing for when a house is eventually built there. I'm going to go to chat now. So if you guys want to open up your chat, I can take any questions you might have and try to answer them. I will tell you this very strange story, and this was not in the story from the book that I read, because I didn't know about it yet. About a year after the book came out, I invited Father Michael Maginot, the exorcist, to come and speak at an event that we had. It was a paranormal film festival, and we showed some films about the paranormal, and I had a panel about demonic possession. And Father Michael was kind enough to come and speak on it, come from Indiana. And it was only during that panel that I discovered this chilling incident that happened after the first attempt at the exorcism of Latoya Amons. Father Mike said that the first exorcism was a bit eventful, that Latoya was growling and she was speaking incoherently and speaking in this chant-like tone. But they felt that she became quiet at the end, and they thought maybe the exorcism had been successful. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink real quick. So they thought that the exorcism had been successful. Oftentimes there's more than one exorcism that's needed, but they thought this had been successful because it had gone from her being animated and very confrontational to very quiet. And so after everyone else had left, Father Michael stayed and talked in the church for a little bit with Latoya. And right before she left, he gave her a rosary to take with her. And she hugged him and said, "Thank you so much, Father. I appreciate everything you've done for my family. God bless you," etc. And they parted. Well, Father Mike stayed up to close up the church, turn off the lights, and lock the doors. And he wasn't living at the rectory at the time. He was living off the location. And so he went out to his car in the parking lot, and Latoya's car had been parked right next to his. In fact, she had arrived before him, and he pulled in and parked right next to her. Well, she now had gone. But when Father Mike went out to the parking lot and approached his car, he found that the rosary that he had given Latoya after this first exorcism, she had torn it to bits, and the pieces of the rosary were scattered on the ground between their two cars. And so then he knew that she would need further exorcisms to rid her of what was troubling her. Chilling. Oh, right. Questions. Had any other family reported anything in the house before the Amons family moved in? No. Of course. Well, for what we know, no one had reported anything in the house before the family moved in. From other conversations I had with Father Mike, as I mentioned in the reading, he believed that the objects that were under the stairs in the basement were used for necromancy. And his feeling was that a child or someone close to someone had died in the house years before, generations before, like when the house was built, like in the 20s or 30s. And that a distraught mother or father had possibly tried to bring the boy back from the dead, bring the boy's spirit back. by using necromancy, and that these objects that were buried under the house had been used for that. That was his feeling. As far as we know, there was someone who had rented the house after LaToya and her family left for a brief period of time before Zak bought the house. And according to testimonials from the landlord or the owner, he said that nothing happened to them while they were in the house either. So it really seemed that this was related to people rather than to the property. One moment. Let me go back up here. Let's see. Can you repeat the name of the new documentary? Not Zak's, but I think Father Maginot's. Oh, I didn't know that. Did I? There's not another documentary that I know of. I'm sorry. I think I had said that Father Maginot spoke at a film festival that we had, and that was just a panel discussion about demonic possession. It wasn't about any specific movie, although we were talking about the movie coming out, and he was talking about the upcoming movie because it wasn't out yet at that time of the panel. And the name of Zak's documentary, of course, is Demon House. Rob, always curious if demons can possess anyone or certain people. Just in case I have an anti-possession tattoo like the TV show Supernatural. Good idea, I would say. You know, they always say it's more likely that you have to invite them in, you know, playing with a Ouija board, dabbling with the occult, or the other option is that you are cursed. And again, Father Mike believed that this family was the target of a curse, and that's how the demons come to carry out the will of the person that puts the curse on the target. So it's really those two things: the dabbling in the occult or the attack with a curse. Sometimes it can be, we're told, like a generational curse. Like if someone in your family was into bad things in the past, there can be a curse that's passed on. The other thing is that we're told that sometimes God can allow demons to possess a child or someone, usually a child, as punishment for the parents, so that the parents will reform themselves, will turn to their faith, return back to God. So there are some different thoughts about how that happens. Let's see here. Jeff, another great ghostly tale. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, I hope you like the book. I really loved writing Haunted Gary. Gary, Indiana is such an interesting place. The stories about the steel mills are just telling, and so many other cool stories in Gary. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know. Let's see. Terry. Hey, Terry. Hey, honey.
Hello.
Gotta read the book. It's really cool. What happened to LaToya's boyfriend? Good question. I always wonder that too. I wonder if he's still with his wife or if she left him. I don't know. Well, I guess like I said, continuing story, right? Thank you so much for being with me tonight. You guys, you can always ask me any questions. Just drop me a line on Facebook, drop me a line via email. I am going to upload this whole event tonight, and I will send you a link. I will post the link on the Facebook page tomorrow. If you're a Patreon patron, thank you. I love you guys so much for your support. Thank you. I will send you an email tomorrow on Patreon with the link as well. Again, the book is Haunted Gary from History Press by myself, Ursula Bielski. I hope I spooked you. I hope you don't sleep a wink. I hope you're scared to death that I've done my job. Good night, all. I love you so much. Thanks for your support. Stay safe, stay well, and I will see you out in the world in public, hopefully very soon. Good night. Love you.
Love you.